December 23, 1944, Seigneur Hill, Belgium. At 11:45 a.m., General Hasso von Manteuffel was still confident in the plan. Surrounding Bastogne meant cutting the Americans in half, quelling resistance, and opening the way to Antwerp. The German command called it inevitable. After all, the sky was still closed, the siege was tightening, and the 101st Airborne was isolated. It was enough to wait. But the logic of the Wehrmacht was about to be crushed, not by tanks, but by parachute. Because, at that moment, 241 C-47 planes tore through the clouds over Bastogne in a geometric, silent, precise formation. And German doctrine, based on speed and audacity, collapsed in the face of an enemy who turned the sky into a supply line. This is the story of a battle where ammunition fell from the air, hope came by glider, and defeat didn't come from the flank, it came from altitude. This video will dissect the siege of Bastogne from the most feared perspective of modern warfare: logistics. Let's prove how America not only propped up a besieged city, but destroyed the trust of an entire army with spreadsheets, factories, and propeller spins. The 101st did not surrender because it never needed to. But before we dive into the data, there is one statistic that defines this story, one that transforms Bastogne from an isolated episode into a symbol of German strategic collapse. While 54,000 Wehrmacht troops, backed by artillery, armor, and the weather itself, surrounded an exhausted American garrison, the U.S. response came neither by ground nor by diplomacy. It came from the sky, measured in tons. In just 2 days, 113 tons of supplies were dropped on Bastogne by planes that flew even under fire, even in flames, even condemned. For every C-47 shot down, another 15 were holding on, as if America had planes to spare. And there was. The Germans called it madness. But they were about to find out that it was just logistics. If you value real history, deep research, and the impact of data that turned the tide of the war, consider liking and subscribing. This helps this channel to continue revealing the invisible gears that have defined the century. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, at 5:30 a.m., more than 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire on the Allied Western Line. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes, reaching more than 130 kilometers of front. It was the beginning of Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last major offensive move on the Western Front. For the German High Command, it was a genius move, a turnaround inspired by the 1940 campaign. But unlike that quick victory over France, this offensive carried an irony that few realized at the time. Germany was betting everything it had left against an enemy that had not even begun to use everything it had. The idea was simple and brutal: to attack in winter through the Ardennes, where the Allies felt safe and unprepared. The goal was to break through the American lines, capture Antwerp, and divide the Anglo-American armies. The plan called for rapid advance along 7 road axes, supported by tanks, infantry, and logistical silence. Bastogne, for Hitler, was a soulless crossroads, just a point on the map that had to be ignored or bypassed. But it was this contempt that would seal the fate of the offensive. The generals blindly trusted the surprise factor, the lack of American preparedness, and the doctrine of the blitzkrieg, the lightning war, which had yielded glory at the beginning of the war. The problem is that by 1944, war was no longer moving at the speed of tanks. It was moving at the speed of supplies. And in this, the United States was playing in another league. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, one of the formations involved in the offensive, was a cruel example of the real situation in Germany. Technically reorganized, in practice, it was a grouping of exhausted veterans, inexperienced recruits, and Luftwaffe remnants deployed to the infantry. General Hasso von Manteuffel himself, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, would later acknowledge that the division possessed limited tactical value. Still, it moved forward with confidence, fueled by promises. America was weak, it was relaxed, its soldiers sought comfort, not resistance. Bastogne was a minor goal, a passing obstacle. This perception contaminated the entire chain of command. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the Excelsior Panzer Corps, even stated that the Americans would not resist more than 48 hours if isolated. And indeed, the German plan called for Bastogne to be cut off in 2 days, long enough for supplies to run out and morale to collapse. Winter, they said, would do the rest. But there was a problem. The Germans calculated based on their own reality, not American reality. They assumed that a surrounded army with no land access would be doomed, and they were right if they were facing themselves. What they ignored was the industrial power of the enemy. While Germany produced 3,000 transport planes during the entire war, the United States produced more than 10,000 of the C-47 model alone. In 1944, for every transport plane available in the Luftwaffe, the US had 15. The ratio in supplies was even more brutal. While a German division depended on horses to move artillery, the 101st would be supplied by air with gasoline, jeeps, plasma, and artillery pieces. American production of supplies was so absurd that in that month, the United States delivered more gasoline by air to Bastogne than Germany could send overland to entire divisions on the Eastern Front. If this statistic surprised you, comment below. Absolute power. Because that's exactly what the German generals were about to discover. The plan of attack was on course. On December 18th, the advance was real. The American defenses, made up of resting or rearguard units, collapsed in some sectors. Bastogne, as predicted, began to be surrounded. The Panzer Division, the 2nd Panzer and the 26th advanced through the narrow, icy roads of the Ardennes. In 3 days, the accesses were practically isolated. From the point of view of the German command, success seemed imminent. But there was one crucial detail that no one in the high command wanted to face. Even in ideal conditions, the fuel depots of the offensive were not enough to reach Antwerp and back. It was a one-way plan, with no margin for logistical failure. That is, if Bastogne held out too long, the entire attack would collapse from mechanical starvation. And that's exactly what happened. Bastogne, ignored at first, would become the gravitational center of the battle. Not because the Americans had a fortress there, but because they were supplied by an entire country, operating like a war plant. The most bitter irony was yet to come. A German commander would later describe with frustration, "We surrounded Bastogne thinking we would win by encirclement. But in doing so, we forced the Americans to prove that they could supply an isolated city as if they were in their own rear. They had dug their own defeat, and they still didn't know it. Because the moment the roads closed, the sky began to open up. And when the first colored parachute floated over the snow, everything the Germans called reality went up in smoke. On December 18, 1944, as panzer divisions confidently traversed the Ardennes, a group of trucks crisscrossed the frozen roads of eastern France toward chaos. Inside them were the men of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. They were young, many under 22, most of them inexperienced in the rigors of the European winter, almost all worn out by the Normandy campaign and the long wait that had left them parked in Mourmelon-le-Grand, supposedly for rest. When the request for reinforcement arrived, there was no time for planning. They were thrown on the roads in forced march with limited rations, inadequate boots, basic ammunition, and no heavy artillery. They arrived in Bastogne in less than 48 hours, exhausted, poorly clothed, and ill-informed about the scale of the approaching offensive. The position they would assume, according to American intelligence, was defensive and temporary. No one predicted that they would be surrounded by 7 enemy divisions. For the German commanders, these soldiers did not pose a serious threat. They were seen as light troops, unsuitable for prolonged resistance, and especially vulnerable to encirclement. This analysis wasn't technically wrong, but it did fail on one unmeasurable factor: the kind of morale that can't be measured in reports. The Screaming Eagles had no tanks. They had no immediate reinforcements. They didn't even have their own generals in the field, but they had a code, the paratroopers' code: never retreat, never surrender, hold the position, even if isolated. When they arrived in Bastogne, they occupied frozen trenches, dilapidated buildings, and windswept hills. They used pylons as barricades, improvised anti-tank mines, and incomplete maps to set up lines of defense. There was no glamour, there was adaptation. The 101st was an expert in this. Since Normandy, it had operated behind enemy lines, accustomed to fighting in numerical inferiority. But in Bastogne, inferiority would become absolute. What the Germans saw as weakness was actually a kind of force that did not fit into the Wehrmacht doctrine, a force built on the absence of guarantees. In the first days of the siege, the paratroopers rationed everything. They ate hardened chocolate, drank melted snow, reused bandages, and shared blankets between 2 or 3 men. Scarcity was treated as routine. The division's greatest asset was not in what it carried, but in how it operated under scarcity. And there was more. The 101st was not alone. At his side were units of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, combat engineers, volunteer medics, and hundreds of soldiers deployed from other formations. Bastogne became a hive of improvised resistance. Each soldier understood that the mission was simple: hold on. Not to win, not to counterattack, only to stop the German advance. American reports at the time point to an average of 3-1 in numerical disadvantage. In some sections of the line, the ratio reached 5-1, and even so, there was no retreat. The first contacts with the enemy revealed something unexpected. The Germans were more tense than they appeared. They met resistance where they expected ruin, and the tighter they pressed, the firmer the answer. A Volksgrenadier commander in later interrogation described the American defense as irrational. They expected a quick retreat, as was standard for encircled forces. What they saw was a brutal blockade. On several occasions, German tanks would stop in front of simple obstacles, only to be destroyed by bazookas hidden in barns, by homemade mines, or by close-range mortars. American soldiers, isolated, resorted to creativity. They turned civilian cars into barriers, used field radios to confuse German signals, and created ghost zones where they simulated movements to distract the enemy. There was no supply line, there was improvisation. And once again, this was what the German doctrine did not foresee. It was based on tactical superiority, not flexibility. At this point, Third Reich propaganda was still selling the idea of an invincible army, supported by discipline, technique, and machines. But Bastogne dismantled this myth with each day of resistance. What German generals called American logistical weakness was revealing itself as a new kind of force, a force that resisted even when the data said it shouldn't. A symbolic detail reinforces this quiet turn. When the Germans tried to infiltrate soldiers in American uniforms to sabotage the lines, they were caught up in trivia questions about baseball teams and gum marks. American culture infiltrated the troops so deeply that identity could not be falsified. Even in this, the Germans were at a disadvantage. And then came the critical moment. On 22nd December, with the encirclement complete, the Germans sent an ultimatum. A formal surrender requirement, written in English and German. The answer was short, a single word: nuts. Later translated to German officers as "go to hell." That was not just a challenge. It was a sign that something greater was sustaining that troop. One German officer would comment after the war, "We offered surrender to a force without supplies, encircled and inferior." They laughed. The laughter in this case came with a message: Bastogne would not fall easily. And as the Germans adjusted their guns for the final assault on the other side of the line, the soldiers of the 101st looked up at the sky, expecting something that would change the entire war, because from then on, the battle would no longer be between men on the ground, and it would become a war of scales between what the Germans had and what the Americans were about to show. By December 21st, 1944, by nightfall, all 7 main roads leading to Bastogne were under German control. The city, situated in the heart of the Ardennes road crossroads, had turned into an island surrounded by steel, snow, and radio silence. The siege was complete. No truck, no train, no ambulance could get in or out. The math of isolation was relentless. 22,000 American troops, ill-equipped and sharing combat rations, facing more than 50,000 German troops, supported by heavy artillery, tanks, and aerial reconnaissance. The German command believed that the outcome was a matter of time. From an operational point of view, Bastogne was already considered a lost city, a pocket doomed to surrender. The maps confirmed the obvious. The garrison was inside a deadly curve. The entire American logistic structure in the sector was interrupted. The nearest supply points had retreated tens of kilometers, and the sky remained closed by thick clouds and continuous snow, making any air help impossible. The Luftwaffe, though worn out, found loopholes for harassment and reconnaissance flights. On the German side, the feeling was one of absolute control of the tactical theater, but what the generals didn't see, or refused to see, was that they were encircling something more than troops. They were surrounding the possibility of a doctrinal rupture. Bastogne was, in practice, a testing area, and the test was just beginning. On the American side, the situation deteriorated with predictable speed. Every grenade counted, each cartridge divided, feeds cut in half, then by a third. Wounded men being treated with paper bandages, melted snow to wash wounds, syringes reused until they lose the needle. The city's central medical post operated on makeshift power, candlelight surgeries, starved plasma, and virtually depleted morphine. The cold has become an active enemy, with temperatures dropping to 15 degrees 6 at night. Soldiers began to show severe signs of hypothermia, limb freezing, emergency amputations, loss of sensation. Many slept in hand-dug holes in the snow, using leaves, cloths, and even maps as blankets. Most were without proper shoes. Standard boots did not protect from moisture or ice. The shelters were far from being prepared for a prolonged winter. The forecast for analysts at Allied headquarters was that if the weather did not improve within 72 hours, Bastogne would become untenable, militarily and morally. The Germans knew this, and they bet on it. For von Lüttwitz's command, it was not necessary to attack with full force. The city would fall by the arithmetic of exhaustion. The German encirclement doctrine itself, refined since the First World War, reinforced this thinking. Cut off the supply, wait for internal collapse, save ammunition. It was the Stalingrad method, now reversed. Winter would do half the work. The rest, statistical logic. Every American tank without gas, each soldier without food, each radio without battery. For Wehrmacht planners, this was the natural cycle of a well-conducted siege, but the mistake was exactly there, in the word natural. Because Bastogne no longer followed the natural laws of war, something invisible sustained that resistance. It wasn't just bravery, it was a variable that Germany in 1944 no longer had, a functional, integrated, living rearguard. Although physically disconnected, the 101st was not forgotten. The American High Command, under Eisenhower, had already made the decision. Bastogne would be supplied at any cost. The problem was time, and time belonged to heaven. On December 22nd, as the Germans drafted the ultimatum to surrender, the weather forecast began to change. Satellites did not exist, but the field data transmitted by weather stations in England indicated a brief window of clarity. Maybe a few hours. Enough. Nobody knew. What they knew was what was at stake. And in response to the German demand, the American command sent a single word: nuts. The message was clear. The city would resist. Even if empty, even if frozen, even if surrounded by 5-1. And while the Germans awaited surrender, the American High Command waited for the sunrise, not out of hope, but for visibility, because if the sky opened, the impossible would have a route. General Heinrich von Luttwitz would later write in his memoirs, "We were encircling a doomed force." But what we didn't know was that they were being armed by the sky, and the sky the next morning would answer. On the morning of December 22nd, with the siege consolidated and the cold turning trenches into temporary graves, the German High Command decided to formalize the American surrender. It was a classic move, offering honorable terms before the final attack. A group of 4 German soldiers, carrying white flags and clean uniforms, approached the American lines via the Arlen Road. One of the officers carried a leather briefcase with documents written in German and English. The ultimatum was straightforward: total surrender within 2 hours or complete annihilation. The German delegation was so confident that they brought blindfolds to the eyes of the American commanders in case they wished to be led to the signing site. On paper, the demand seemed fair: an isolated garrison, surrounded by superior forces, with no visible supplies and no reinforcement capacity. In the logic of traditional warfare, the answer would be the white flag, but the Americans sent another color: cynicism. The response was signed by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne. A single word: nuts. To the Germans, that didn't make sense. Nüsse? In their language, it meant nuts. Confused, they asked for explanations. Colonel Harry Kinnard explained, "It means they can go to hell." The message was passed on, still in disbelief, to General von Luttwitz. The impact was immediate, not tactically, but psychologically. For the first time in the entire siege, the Germans faced a type of resistance that was not included in manuals. They offered logic, they received derision, they expected surrender, they received pride. Germany, structured on discipline and hierarchy, could not understand that gesture. But for Americans, nuts was more than a refusal. It was a symbol, a declaration that even hungry, freezing, and with no prospect of reinforcement, they would not recognize defeat. It was the spirit of a division accustomed to being thrown behind enemy lines. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. There was no way to beat a troop that fought with this kind of morale, and that still had the largest logistical machine ever set in motion. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe, so we can bring you more detailed content about the logistical backstage of World War II. In the days following the response, the Germans intensified their attacks. But something had changed. The besieging troops, once confident, now questioned. Why would an army about to collapse refuse reasonable terms? The American command knew that there was still no way to reverse the situation on the ground. But that response was carefully calculated to keep alive a narrative of resistance until heaven cooperated. General McAuliffe was not naive. He knew that soldiers needed more than ammunition. They needed meaning, and the word nuts gave just that, a cohesive point, a moral response to pressure. Around the trenches, soldiers began to write the word on the walls, on the helmets, on the ammunition boxes. It spread like a mantra. The enemy did not understand, but the men surrounded understood. As long as that word circulated, Bastogne would not fall. General Kokot of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division commented after the war, "We hoped that logic would win out. They responded in faith." What the Germans didn't know is that while trying to decipher the meaning of that answer, the Allied command was already preparing something even more surprising, because the sky, until then immobile, was about to open. And when that happened, nuts would no longer be just a word. It would be supplied by tons. During the first 6 days of the siege of Bastogne, the real battlefield commander was neither General McAuliffe nor General von Lüttwitz. It was heaven, a grey, closed, frozen sky which sealed the fate of thousands of men below him. Meteorology, always neglected in classical doctrines, had become the Wehrmacht's most strategic weapon. Dense, low clouds prevented any aerial visibility. The accumulated snow reduced mobility. The freezing fog erased the contours of the front line. For the first time since D-Day, German forces could move in daylight without the constant fear of being torn apart by machine guns from a diving thunderbolt. No American air patrol could cross that climate blockade. It was as if the heavens had temporarily closed the gates of the Allied arsenal. On the ground, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne lived another reality. They counted cartridges by hand, improvised flashlights with battery remnants, and used socks as bandages. The K ration was divided into 3. Each grenade was a luxury item. Every day the wounded increased and morphine stocks dwindled. The radios squeaked with static. Frozen batteries lost power. Without air support, without supplies, the war was back to its raw state, man against man, trench against trench. And the Germans, watching from their lofty positions, interpreted the silence of heaven as confirmation of an inevitable surrender. There was no movement of reinforcements. No convoy was approaching. No bombs fell on his lines. The siege had been successful. They dominated the terrain. And the climate, as if conspiring with the Reich, completed the trap. General Kokott of the 26th Volksgrenadier would later note, "It has never been easier to organize offensive positions in broad daylight. We were free to concentrate strength. During these days, the Luftwaffe, though weakened, dared short flights, low-altitude reconnaissance, and even light bombing raids over Bastogne. It was a complete reversal of the air balance established since 1943, and that's why it's so intoxicating. The Germans believed that time would do the job that tanks didn't need to do, that the cold would break the American spirit, as it had done with the Russians at Stalingrad. But there was a subtle and devastating difference. In Bastogne, winter was not a natural agent. It was a tactical variable, and the German doctrine, focused on quick maneuvers and logistical collapses, had no alternative plan when the weather ceased to cooperate. Because that was the blind spot of Hitler's strategy. By relying on time as an ally, the German High Command ignored the true scale of US logistical power. All it took was a change of climate, a ray of sunshine, a clear morning. And the battlefield would be reconfigured, not by tanks, but by planes. Colonel Manteuffel himself, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, would admit in post-war testimony, "We have become dependent on the weather. When the clouds parted, the illusion of superiority would disappear." During the height of the European winter, the American military machine seemed inert. But it just seemed so. At air bases in England and France, thousands of tons of supplies were ready to fly. Gliders were loaded. Pilots were on standby. And in a bunker south of London, Allied meteorologists watched every wind current, every atmospheric variation, waiting for the breach. The German soldiers in Bastogne looked at the grey sky with confidence. They didn't see clouds, they saw shields. What they did not understand was that these clouds did not protect their offensive, they only postponed their defeat. Because when the weather changed, it wasn't bullets or tanks that would redefine warfare. It was numbers. And those numbers were already flying. Lieutenant Helmut Becker of the German artillery described it this way: "We thought winter was our ally, but it wasn't winter that held Americans back. It was just the timer of his response." On December 22nd, the sky still remained sealed. The The thermometers marked 10 degrees. The men of the 101st slept in ice-covered holes, and the Germans, believing they had won, reinforced positions for the final attack. But the atmosphere showed signs. A warm air front was approaching the English Channel. The clouds were beginning to rise. In London, the weather report of the Air Command's O Group indicated possible operational opening on the morning of the 23rd. This phrase, encoded, was transmitted to all air transport units. The next morning, the war would change its axis, and the skies, once silent, would become the greatest logistical nightmare the Germans had ever faced. Because what they called time, the Americans called the window. And that window was about to open. On the morning of December 23, 1944, at 11:03 a.m., the first sign that the war had changed came in the form of a buzzing sound, faint, distant, but growing like a tide of propellers. The sky, covered for days by low clouds and dense fog, finally opened like a curtain pulled by invisible hands. A dry air front had pushed the wet mass to the east, and with it came light. It wasn't just a sunny day. It was the opening of the largest air supply corridor the war had ever seen. At 11:45 a.m., 241 C-47 Dakota aircraft appeared on the horizon in precise formation, like a column of steel floating over the white field. Each carried tons of ammunition, food, medical supplies, radios, blankets, artillery pieces, batteries, thermal boots, and plasma. From the ground, the soldiers of the 101st looked up in silence, many for the last time believing they would survive. It was more than help, it was redemption. The parachutes opened like flowers in the sky, colored in white, yellow, green, and red, each color indicating a type of load. They fell like a choreographed rain in areas previously marked with panels and smoke, instructions that had been arranged weeks earlier for an eventuality that now became real. Each delivery point was accurately identified by reconnaissance planes and by the instructions transmitted in Morse code by operators still active inside Bastogne. What could be seen from above was a dying city that suddenly began to breathe. German anti-aircraft batteries, positioned around the city, opened fire in desperation. The flak 80mm artillery, feared for its accuracy, attempted to form a steel barrier between the planes and the ground. But the problem was the scale. For every C-47 that caught fire, another 15 went in a straight line, at minimum altitudes, disregarding the danger. Pilots maintained the routes even with damaged engines, even with punctured fuselages, just to ensure that the shipment was launched. Some crew members were seen manually throwing boxes through the rear door with parachutes tied by improvised ropes. One of them, seriously injured, died minutes after the launch, but his supplies arrived intact. In less than 2 hours, 144 tons of supplies had been successfully delivered. It was the first of several waves. That afternoon, 160 additional planes flew over the city. In total, as of December 23rd, more than 250 tons of critical materials have touched the ground. Doctors cried as they received morphine. Cooks lit stoves with fuel they hadn't seen in days. Troops reorganized defenses with fresh ammunition, light weapons, updated maps, and long-range radios. In one of the delivery zones, soldiers found packages with handwritten messages. "Hold on, we are coming." It was more than logistics. It was a moral response, a reminder that the American effort was not just tactical, it was systemic. Each flight was organized by hundreds of technicians, engineers, radio operators, meteorologists, and logistical commanders who moved in sync from bases in England to refueling centers in Normandy. The air supply of Bastogne was not an improvisation. It was the pure application of what the Germans no longer had: integration. On the ground, the Germans watched in silence. Colonel Rudolf Langhauser of the 5th Grenadier Division wrote in his diary, "We were masters of the soil, but we no longer knew what that meant. America had turned the sky into a railroad. The Luftwaffe, practically non-existent in that region, did not react. What little was left of his force had been concentrated on trying to counter the strategic bombing raids on German cities. Bastogne, in turn, was delivered. What most surprised the Wehrmacht commanders was not just the number of planes, it was the precision, the regularity, the speed with which each element of the operation fit together. A besieged city with no land contact received supplies more efficiently than many German divisions received from the rear. General von Muntefel would later confess, "We didn't understand that. For us, logistics was a map and a road. For Americans, it was a system that started thousands of miles away. In Bastogne, the sound of propellers replaced the sound of silence. Each surrender was a sentence against the siege. The nuts, answered 2 days earlier, was now gaining physical weight. The city, which should have been suffocated, was arming itself again. And the Germans, once confident, now watched the impossible. Hungry soldiers, rising to their feet, firing with renewed accuracy, rearranging lines with supplies that had literally fallen from the sky. In the following days, the number of aircraft would increase, and with it, a new weapon would be unleashed, not on the Germans, but on the very logic of war. Because if America could supply a besieged city as easily as it supplied a secure base, then there was no more rearguard or front line. There was only reach, and the reach of the United States was just beginning. On December 24th, with the city of Bastogne still under siege, the real American weapon finally revealed itself. It was not a bomb, nor a tank, nor even a specific plane. It was the system. War, at that point, had changed its nature. Victory was not being decided by the accuracy of shots or the displacement of armored divisions. It was being measured in color. Red, blue, green, yellow, and white, each encoding a specific type of cargo that now fell with mathematical accuracy on a besieged city. The white parachutes brought food, the blues, ammunition, the greens, medical equipment, the reds, radios and batteries, the yellow ones, spare parts and boots. It was not improvisation, it was a logistical orchestra. For each drop zone, there was a predefined coordinate, a ground signaling code, and a consumption estimate for the next 3 days. The gliders didn't just carry supplies. They brought disassembled jeeps, light artillery pieces, plasma boxes for transfusion, portable generators, and even volunteer doctors. In a matter of hours, Bastogne went from absolute isolation to functional logistical node. What the Germans observed with binoculars was not a tactical miracle. It was the materialization of something that his doctrine did not foresee: war as production. And production, at the end of 1944, was no longer in Germany. The Luftwaffe, out of fuel and with inexperienced pilots, offered no resistance. Its collapse wasn't just airborne. It was accounting. In 1944, Germany produced just over 40,000 aircraft. The United States, in the same year, produced 96,000. That's right, more than double. And not just fighter jets, but bombers, freighters, patrol planes, medical transport, and reconnaissance. American aviation was not a force. It was an infrastructure. If this number impressed you, comment now with "shocking data." Because for the Wehrmacht soldiers, the shock was literal. They still tried to move divisions with wagons, horses and trains interrupted by sabotage. Their supplies came along destroyed roads and had to cross hundreds of miles to feed advancing troops. The Americans, on the other hand, dropped tons of supplies in millimeter precision over a besieged city in the middle of winter, without depending on a single road. It was no longer about courage, it was engineering. Each item launched in Bastogne was part of a production chain that began in factories in Michigan, passed through logistics centers in Liverpool, was transported on Liberty ships, unloaded in Normandy, repacked at bases in the French countryside, and taken by trains to airfields, prepared for synchronized launches. The system was so robust that it could lose 15% of loads and still outrun any intact German supply line. The difference was structural. While the Reich tried to maintain offensives with captured trucks and synthetic fuels, the Americans set up mobile depots, redundant air routes, and parallel operations with gliders and cargo paratroopers. The result was brutal. The German soldiers, seeing Bastogne resist and worse, rearm, began to understand what Nazi propaganda hid. Germany could no longer sustain a war of attrition. General Hasso von Manteuffel would later admit, "We did not understand what we were facing. We thought we were surrounding soldiers. We were surrounding an industrial gear." And this gear did not stop. With each day of clear skies, more aircraft appeared. Within 2 days, more than 500 planes had flown over Bastogne. It was the equivalent of an entire small national air force, focused on feeding a city. It was not just a tactical victory, it was a structural humiliation. And from the German point of view, there was no answer, because it's not just about plane against plane. It is a question of system against system. And the American system, integrated, redundant, adaptable, was the portrait of a civilization in total war. The Nazis relied on the weather, tanks, and obedience. Americans relied on mass production, reverse engineering, data streams, railroad trains, radar technicians, and Morse code operators. It was the clash between hierarchical discipline and industrial fluidity. Bastogne was just the microcosm of a larger collapse. The doctrine of the Reich had been designed for rapid shocks, not for prolonged resistance, for lightning offensives, not to keep siege against an enemy who could get his fill from the sky. When Hitler designed Operation Wacht am Rhein, he still believed that the war would be won by maps and maneuvers. What he did not foresee was that in 1944, victory would be decided by tons. The next issue would make that clear, because while Bastogne was getting 500 tons through the air, a new attacking force was on the move, and this would not come through the skies. It would come through the ground, with tanks that, until that moment, the Germans thought destroyed. The first few hours after the supplies were dropped didn't just bring relief to Bastogne's defenders, they brought something far more dangerous to German morale: doubt. The Wehrmacht, until then convinced that the city would fall through hunger, cold, or weariness, saw its narrative crumble before a sky that now worked for the enemy. German artillery kept firing, but each burst seemed less significant in the face of planes arriving in constant waves, indifferent to anti-aircraft fire, indifferent to risk, indifferent to the traditional rules of war. For the first time since the offensive began, German commanders realized that their arithmetic no longer made sense. They counted roads, warehouses, and horses. The Americans counted engines, manufacturing units, and production shifts. General Kokott, commander of the 26th Volksgrenadier, would note in the post-war period that we were not fighting an army, we were fighting a flying factory. This sentence, though written years later, accurately describes the growing sentiment among the besieging troops. It didn't matter how many positions they took, how many siege rings they tightened, how many shots they fired. Bastogne was still alive, and worse, it continued to grow stronger. The German binoculars showed a movement that ran counter to all military logic. Troops who should have been starving to death were rearranging positions, changing boots, reloading weapons with newly arrived ammunition, lighting stoves with gasoline poured from gliders. German propaganda, which insisted on portraying Americans as comfortable, lazy, and dependent on excess, showed signs of wear and tear at the front itself. Soldiers began to whisper in the shelters how to fight an enemy that received unlimited supplies from all corners of the sky. The initial confidence, built on lightning victories and fast armored columns, turned to unrest. The Luftwaffe, absent, offered no counterpoint. With no air cover, no fuel, and no experienced pilots, She had simply disappeared from the battlefield, leaving the Reich exposed to American logistical humiliation. At several points, the German reaction was one of open frustration. Officers reported feeling helpless when they saw that their attacks did not alter the flow of American supplies. It was like trying to dry an ocean with your hands. The psychological impact was so profound that in some units, soldiers began to declare that the war was lost, not because of defeat in combat, but because of an imbalance of resources. Von Manteuffel admitted, "We realized that the enemy could sustain the impossible." That was equivalent to a sentence. And as these conclusions quietly spread through the German trenches, an even greater shadow loomed to the south. It didn't come from heaven this time. It came by road, and it brought steel, fuel, and a general who did not believe in pauses. Because, while the Germans were digesting moral defeat, George S. Patton's Third Army was already on the move. When the sun lit up the Ardennes again on December 23rd and 24, it wasn't just the light that touched the German front. It was a predator. With the sky finally clear of clouds, the U.S. 8th Air Force and 9th Tactical Command authorized the entry of a weapon that the Germans thought was familiar with, but whose scale they had never faced, the P-47 Thunderbolt. A heavy, rugged fighter bomber capable of absorbing damage and still pouring destruction in a straight line. At 10:20 a.m., the first squadrons began to cross the Bastogne region. From that moment on, the fight on the ground ceased to be the axis of the battle. The war was decided by altitude. The German columns, which had advanced in the previous days confidently under protective fog, were now exposed as targets in training. Ammunition trucks, columns of infantry, cannons towed by horses, tanks fueling on the side of frozen roads, all became a point of sight for a fighter capable of diving at more than 700 km/h, releasing 114mm rockets and still sweeping the road with 850 caliber machine guns. Within hours, German mobility evaporated. The Blitzkrieg doctrine, based on continuous speed, psychological collapse, and surprise attack, found its fatal limit. Without air supremacy, lightning war became static war. Soldiers who had once marched in groups now crawled in single ranks, seeking shelter in narrow ditches. Officials reported that any movement greater than one step immediately attracted a gust from above. The main roads, essential for reaching the Meuse River, became linear graveyards of burned-out vehicles. With each attack, the pilots reported the same image: entire columns trying to disperse, but not fast enough to escape the crosshairs. The Luftwaffe tried to react with a few remaining units, Me-109s and FW-190s sent in a hurry, but they were few, disorganized, out of fuel, and often flown by young men who didn't even have advanced training. The air battles lasted minutes, and they always ended the same way: the sky clear for the next American attack. It was the final confirmation of an industrial asymmetry that had been widening since 1943. The United States produced more than 2,600 P-47s per year. Germany, in the same period, had drastically reduced its capacity to manufacture fighters, compromised by strategic bombing and shortages of raw materials. In simple terms, the Americans could lose 10 planes to destroy one target, and yet they would win. An intercepted German report later summarized, "Every road is death, every move is seen, every mistake is final." The psychological impact was devastating. Troops who until the previous day had moved confidently began to abandon vehicles and walk through the forest, trying to evade the air patrol. The 5th Panzer Army sent desperate messages asking for additional camouflage, nets, smoke, and even prohibiting daylight movements. The German offensive, built on the initial momentum, had stalled. The Panzer IV and Panther tanks, so feared by American infantry in direct combat, were now forced to hide under barns, bridges, and rock formations. Without mobility, they ceased to be offensive weapons and became static targets. American technological superiority, more stable radios, Air-ground coordination, integrated doctrine between aircraft and ground units, amplified the effect. Fighters and bombers circled continuously, destroying fuel depots, barrels of ammunition, and any sign of troop concentration. The Wehrmacht was held not by barbed wire, but by visibility. Everything that moved was observed. Everything that was observed was attacked. This was the actual death of the Blitzkrieg, not in Moscow, not in Normandy, but in the Ardennes, when the sky became the American operational frontier. General von Manteuffel, in analyzing the collapse of his offensive after the war, wrote, "When we lose the clouds, we lose the initiative. When we lose the initiative, we lose the war." However, what would come next would show that thunderbolts were only part of the equation. The air offensive was devastating. But there was something even more symbolic, even more shocking to German troops, the moment when they realized that the Americans didn't just use the sky to kill, they used it to resupply, reorganize, and strengthen. If the thunderbolts represented brute force, the next revelation would represent something even greater, the power of logistics that respected no siege, winter, or geography. Because while the Germans buried themselves in the snow to avoid gusts from the sky, a new shadow began to move south. A shadow that carried not only air power, but engines, steel, and speed. It was the growing roar of American armored units that, according to the Germans, could not arrive in time. But they would arrive. The Germans believed from the first day of the offensive that Bastogne would be just a detail, a point on the road that would give way under pressure, hunger, and cold. The siege, for them, was the repetition of a familiar pattern. Weaken the enemy by cutting its lines, cut it off and let it crumble, as had happened to encircled forces at Dunkirk 4 years earlier. But historical irony was brewing. Bastogne would not be an echo of 1940. It would be a mirror of 1942, the inverted Stalingrad of the Wehrmacht. At Stalingrad, it was the Germans who found themselves trapped in a pocket, waiting for supplies that would never arrive. In Bastogne, they became the besiegers, who watched the enemy receive from heaven what the Reich could not provide even to its own armies. German confidence, built on the belief that the 101st Airborne would not survive in isolation, turned into a monumental strategic mistake. Von Luttwitz's command prioritized the race to the Meuse River, withdrawing armored units that could crush the American perimeter. Bastogne was not attacked with sufficient force, not out of caution, but out of arrogance. It was believed that the city would fall by gravity, like a ripe fruit. This neglect made room for what the Americans would do best: reorganize, adapt, and turn the impossible into an operational procedure. As the Germans tightened the siege slowly, relying on the cold that killed their own men, the Americans improvised defenses, consolidated positions, and prepared drop zones. It was precisely the slowness of German pressure, the result of blind confidence in the inevitability of victory, that allowed American engineers to plan flares, drop maps, and air routes even under bombardment. On the German front, the initial perception was one of absolute advantage. They dominated the roads, they controlled the perimeter, the atmosphere was in favor. But this dominance was illusory. Stalingrad had taught the Soviets that encircling an enemy is not enough. It is necessary to suffocate him quickly before his allies react. Germany, however, did not apply its own lesson. The Wehrmacht believed that time was allied, not enemy. And this assumption, this reliance on stagnation, proved fatal. When the sky opened, the besieging soldiers discovered that they had become unwitting guardians of an air fortress. It was no longer Bastogne who was surrounded. It was they, surrounded by their own inability to prevent the Americans from growing stronger. At Stalingrad, the Sixth Army waited for weeks for the supplies that Göring had promised and never delivered. At Bastogne, the Germans watched enemy supplies arrive within hours, in quantities that surpassed anything they had seen since the beginning of the war. The irony was almost cruel. The same generals who had previously announced, "The siege is closed, victory is certain," now observed the mathematics of disaster. The city that was supposed to fall for lack of ammunition was firing more than before. The city that was supposed to freeze was distributing thousands of blankets. The city that was supposed to go blind was getting radios, batteries, and even doctors. The Wehrmacht, the force that had built its reputation on continuous advance, was now stuck with its own initial success, unable to move under the gaze of the P-47s and unable to quickly break through a defense rejuvenated by supplies from the sky. The German mistake was not only tactical, it was philosophical. They were fighting a 1940 war in 1944. They believed that battles were decided by terrain, movement and surprise, when, at that point, they were decided by industrial capacity, logistical network, and air dominance. Bastogne was no longer a city. It was a symbol. It was living proof that Germany had gone beyond the limit of its own doctrine, and even worse, he had created with his own hands the stage of his symbolic defeat. If they had ignored Bastogne, bypassed the city, and advanced with full force on the Meuse, they might have prolonged the offensive. But by encircling the 101st, they gave the United States a chance to show something the Wehrmacht never believed possible: to supply a beleaguered force with precision, constancy, and abundance. The city that was supposed to represent the American collapse became a witness to the German ideological collapse. General Kokott, years later, would describe the sight of the 241 C-47s as the revelation that our fate was sealed. But Bastogne had not yet revealed his last letter, because as planes refueled the defenders, something else moved beyond the range of German binoculars. American tanks advanced day and night, cutting through frozen ground, clearing the way for a battle-changing counterattack. The sound of its engines, initially distant, would soon become the announcement of the inevitable. In the early hours of December 25, 1944, when snow was still falling in thick slabs over the frozen perimeter of Bastogne, the Wehrmacht began what it would later call its last rational attempt to break American resistance. It was the Christmas attack, an offensive that on German maps looked like a final blow, but in reality was born out of the sum of desperation, lack of fuel, and a misreading of the real state of the 101st Airborne. Von Lüttwitz believed that the Americans were weakened after days of siege. "I didn't know that just 48 hours earlier, hundreds of tons of ammunition, plasma, rations, and spare parts had fallen from the sky like an artificial blizzard." He did not know that the gliders on the 24th brought jeeps, surgeons, and new artillery pieces. Therefore, he launched his troops with the conviction that he would push the enemy towards collapse. At 3 a.m., German artillery broke the silence. This was followed by the advance of grenadiers supported by 18 tanks, Panzer IV and some Panthers, advancing through the western sector, attempting to exploit a temporary breach in the 327th Infantry Regiment. German tactics, however, were fragmented. Instead of concentrating forces in a single massive blow, they attacked in small, isolated packets, without full coordination and without air cover. It was an attack conceived under the mentality of 1940, launched against an enemy that morning represented the industrial war of 1944. As the tanks broke through the first line, the snow rose up like white dust. For a few moments it seemed that the German offensive might infiltrate into the defensive center, but then the 101st responded, not with improvisation, not with spent weapons, not with rationed ammunition, but with renewed power. The soldiers, who 3 days earlier had been counting cartridges, now pulled newly arrived grenades from their bags. The 30-caliber machine guns returned to singing with complete tapes. The anti-tank guns, which had previously only 2 or 3 charges left, were now fed continuously. It was as if the city itself had been resurrected. At the height of the German offensive, something even more symbolic happened. In one of the gaps opened by the panzers, The 463rd Field Artillery Battalion repositioned its pieces. At 07:18 a.m., they began firing projectiles that had been parachuted just 2 days earlier. It was the perfect picture of German strategic collapse. A surrounded force firing fresh ammunition at an army that, ironically, was also beginning to suffer shortages. German tanks were advancing with increasing caution. Many were on limited fuel, and some officers would later admit that the calculation was simple. If the attack failed, not everyone would have the gasoline to retreat. That is exactly what happened. 12 of the 18 tanks were destroyed before reaching the primary objective. 2 managed to get deeper into the perimeter, but were neutralized by the improvised armored force sent by the division's headquarters, again supplied by air. The German infantry, which were coming behind, found a living wall. The Americans, now hot, fed and rearmed, fought with disciplined ferocity. With each grenade thrown, each volley fired, it became evident that the siege was no longer a sentence for the 101st. It was a burden to those who surrounded him. At this point, you need to take a break. In 1944, the United States produced more than 40,000 trucks per month. Germany, in the same period, produced just over 4,000. In other words, the American ability to maintain an offensive or resupply a defense was 10 times greater. If this disproportion surprised you, comment now with "Logistics wins," because that's exactly what happened on Christmas morning. When the remaining Germans retreated, leaving bodies in the snow, unexploded grenades and burning tanks, the symbology became clear. An entire offensive had been destroyed by an enemy that, in German logic, should have been crushed 3 days earlier. News of the failure spread quickly through the Wehrmacht's lines. The myth that Bastogne would fall inevitably dissolved. Officers began to question how long they could keep their own troops supplied, knowing that the Americans, the besieged, were better supplied than they were. Natal's tactical defeat was only half the wound. The other half was moral. Because the date, loaded with religious significance, became the scene of a symbolic collapse. On the day when the Reich hoped to be politically reborn with victory in the Ardennes, it saw its last hope evaporate under the force of an enemy who refused to die and, to make matters worse, received strength from heaven. As snow covered the smouldering remnants of the German attack, a new threat loomed across the roads to the south. Metal footsteps, vibrating engines, columns advancing without pause. American tanks that, according to German calculations, would never arrive in time. But the calculations were wrong, and the revelation would come with the roar of Patton's engines. The march that would take the Third Army to Bastogne began even before the siege was officially recognized. As the Wehrmacht tightened the ring around the city, George S. Patton was already redrawing his mental map of the front. Within hours, he had ordered 3 entire divisions to rotate 90 degrees in the middle of winter, crossing frozen roads, brittle soil, flimsy bridges, and scattered enemy columns. It was a move that, according to German calculations, would require at least a week. Patton executed him in 2 days. The 4th Armored Division, led by Hugh Gaffey and with the spearhead handed over to Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, advanced as if winter was just another obstacle to be crushed. His Sherman tanks drove through seemingly abandoned villages, past U.S. supply columns moving in reverse, and proceeded in tense silence, aware that every hour lost was a sentence for the men besieged in Bastogne. When the German offensive still believed it had control of the weather, Patton proved otherwise. He didn't need clear skies to win. He just needed traction, fuel, and determination. Every mile, engineering crews cleared roads, cleared mines, and reinforced makeshift bridges, while radios beamed frantic updates. Villages taken, sections contested, ambushes repelled. The advance was not fast because the logistics impelled it. It was fast because there was no alternative. For Patton's tanks, fuel came from makeshift depots stocked by Operation Red Ball Express, a gigantic logistics network that delivered gasoline and spare parts in a continuous stream. Every truck that fueled a Sherman south of Bastogne was the result of thousands of drivers, mechanics and stockists working around the clock. This is what the Germans did not understand. To move a tank, the Americans moved a nation. On the afternoon of 26th of December, at about 4:50 p.m., the unit led by Abrams reached the German forward positions south of Bastogne. The German defenders, now fragmented and exhausted, tried to block the advance with small arms fire and a few poorly placed anti-tank guns, but Patton's armored division was at too much speed to be contained. Within minutes, the fighting turned into a German retreat. The spearhead advanced through the village of Assenois, and at 5:04 p.m., the first Sherman tanks officially broke through the German line. When Abrams entered Bastogne's defensive perimeter, there was no celebration. There were no flags raised. There were no speeches. What there were frozen men covered in soot, with red eyes and hands shivering with cold. Men who had survived thanks to colorful parachutes and who were now facing the final proof that they had not resisted in vain. The soldiers of the 101st did not run to meet the armored column. Some remained in their positions, unable to believe that the siege had been broken. Others just nodded, as if seeing American tanks was part of a dream that was hard to achieve. Abrams, stepping out of his command car, greeted the officers present with the simplicity of someone who understood that this was not glory, it was necessity. The land connection had been re-established. The supply line was complete again. The siege had not only been broken, it had been defeated. American logistics, for the second time in 3 days, had turned the impossible into routine. For the Germans, Patton's arrival was more than a military defeat. It was the final blow to the narrative that the Reich still possessed operational initiative. They had bet everything on speed, surprise, and chaos. The Americans responded with method, production, and persistence. The German offensive, which was intended to cut the Western Front in half, was now riven by its own inability to stop the advance of an army that seemed to ignore winter, terrain, and logic. The battle for Bastogne was not yet completely over, but for all who watched the Shermans enter the city, one thing became clear. Germany had lost more than one position. It had lost its chance. And to the north, a new statistic awaited to redefine the fate of the entire offensive, revealing that what had happened in Bastogne was only the prelude to an even greater collapse. Bastogne's refueling operation, often remembered for the heroic image of C-47s crossing the sky, was not born at the front. It was born behind the scenes, in stuffy hangars, planning rooms with map-covered walls, warehouses stacked with coded boxes, and weather stations that by December 1944 carried more strategic weight than entire battalions. The gear began to turn on the night of December 22nd, when Allied meteorology finally detected a weather window that could allow visual flight. It was narrow, uncertain, dangerous, but it was an opportunity, and for a logistics machine capable of mobilizing hundreds of aircraft in a few hours, that was all it needed. At 2:00 a.m., the Pathfinder teams, units specializing in navigation and marking, were ordered to take off. They were the invisible eyes and hands of the operation. Without them, there would be no launch zone, there would be no coordination, there would be no delivery. Each team carried Eureka transmitters, reflectors, camouflage panels, and flares that placed at specific points would create an artificial air corridor for the C-47s to follow. At 09:35 a.m., these men jumped on Bastogne under light fire from automatic weapons and immediately began to prepare the ground. They marked the launch zones with pre-established codes that would be read by pilots flying at more than 200 kilometers at H. They then tested radio equipment, established contact with the American command inside the lines, and confirmed that the sectors were sufficiently clean to receive the first wave. The operation depended on the accuracy of these minutes. If a zone was misplaced, supplies would fall into German hands. If the signals failed, hundreds of tons would be wasted. If the Pathfinders were killed before completing their mission, the entire operation would collapse. The next gear involved the supply depots. Each box had to be packed with parachutes of the right color, with the right weight, and with the type of lashing corresponding to the item being transported. Red meant heavy ammunition. Blue, medical supplies. Yellow, rations. White, general equipment. Green, signage supplies. It was a visual language capable of transforming a chaotic launch into an organized inventory. The military on the ground knew exactly where to run. It was the economy of war applied to the second. Meanwhile, mechanics overhauled engines, filled tanks, checked compressors and checked flaps. Every C-47 had to be in perfect condition. They weren't armored bombers, they were transport planes, vulnerable, driven by reliance on engineering. And even so, hundreds were released for almost simultaneous flight. Coordination between them required an expanded control tower, where operators calculated collision avoidance routes, set millimeter spacing between formations, and maintained communication with ground units. Every 5 minutes, an additional group lined up on the track. Every 5 minutes, the sky gained new silhouettes. The use of gliders represented another technical chapter of the operation. Towing by C-47s, they carried cargo that could not be dropped by parachute. Jeeps, long-range radios, generators, artillery pieces, and boxes containing refrigerated blood, something that German medicine could not provide even to its elite units. Landing was always risky. Gliders had no engine. They depended solely on the pilot's skill and luck. Many were shattered on impact, but their charges survived, and that was all that mattered. Germany, watching from the top of hills and makeshift towers, tried to decipher what was happening. They saw planes that came up at regular intervals, as if coming off a continuous production line. They did not know that, in fact, it was exactly that. The United States produced at that time more than 5,000 aircraft per month. This means that in just 1 week, America was producing more planes than the Luftwaffe could keep operational on the entire Western Front. It was the victory of the factory over doctrine. It was the confirmation that, at that moment of the war, whoever owned the industry had the future. The final coordination between gunners on the ground and pilots in the air completed the system. Drop zones were immediately cleared by previously designated units, which picked up cargo, redistributed supplies, and reported on needs for the next waves. There was no improvisation. There was flow. The delivery of each box already fed directly into decisions for the next flight. The operation was so efficient that just minutes after the gliders landed, surgeons were already performing transfusions. Just minutes after the parachutes touched the ground, soldiers were already cocking weapons with newly arrived ammunition. Such synchrony was impossible for Germany, whose logistics depended on broken roads, bombed-out railways, and draft horses. Bastogne proved an uncomfortable reality for the Reich. Modern warfare no longer belonged to the army that advanced the fastest, but to the one that resupplied furthest. And this replenishment had reached a level that bordered on the scientific. However, there was still a hidden element to this cog, something that the Germans would not realize until too late, a statistic that could explain why no encirclement would work against the United States. And that statistic would reveal itself in the next phase of the offensive, when Germany found that even its greatest tactical victories were nullified by an enemy who could replace everything, men, machines, and ammunition, in weeks, days, or even hours. In the winter of 1944, as the soldiers of the 101st Airborne froze in the trenches of Bastogne and the C-47s crossed the sky laden with colorful parachutes, the real force behind that operation was not in Belgium. It was thousands of miles away, hidden behind industrial smokestacks, assembly lines, and sirens on duty. It was the factory that was fighting. Germany saw the planes, but it did not see what sustained each flight. Millions of workers, men, women, immigrants, farmers, turned laborers, who turned the American mainland into an uninterrupted war machine. In Detroit, assembly lines capable of mass-producing cars were converted into Pratt & Whitney engine plants. In Tulsa, tens of thousands of parachutes were sewn by female workers who would never set foot in Europe, but whose hands fed entire regiments. In pharmaceutical factories in California, ampules of morphine were filled at such a rate that doctors in Bastogne were able to treat the wounded with supplies that, ironically, were more modern than those available to high-ranking German officers. In Chicago, steel mills worked day and night to supply aluminum sheets that would shape the C-47s. Planes built in such vast numbers that no German pilot could believe it when he saw the continuous waves in the sky. This is where the structural irony is revealed. Germany fought with soldiers. The United States struggled with workers. The Wehrmacht relied on improvised logistics, risky roads, and synthetic fuels. America, on the other hand, created redundant production lines, exclusive railroad networks, underground depots, and air routes that could be rearranged in a matter of hours. The ability to replace losses was so absurd that by 1944, the United States was producing more ammunition per month than Germany could distribute on the entire Western Front. More than that, each item thrown at Bastogne contained, silently, the work of thousands of people. A yellow parachute for rations epitomized agricultural workers converted into packing technicians. A container of plasma summarized universities, laboratories, doctors researching methods of blood preservation. A box of .30 caliber ammunition summarized miners extracting ore in Minnesota, steel workers smelting steel, and engineers overseeing millimeter tolerances. And all of this was delivered with a level of automation and control that the Reich simply could not keep up with. Germany believed that its military doctrine, its heavy tanks, and its experienced officers could make up for industrial inferiority. But Bastogne demonstrated that there was not enough courage in the world to bridge the chasm between two economies that operated in different logics. The irony of this story is that the solution lay in front of them. It wasn't to win battles, it was to sustain armies. And if you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe, so we can bring you more in-depth content. For the Germans, the shock came not only from the planes, but from the realization that every bomb dropped, every shot fired, and every supply delivered had behind it a production chain that was impossible to sabotage. A German officer would later write, "America was a factory without borders. I fought with metal, wheat, electricity, and oil. And the final proof of that power was about to emerge, not in the sky, but in the post-war archives, when German commanders admitted that Bastogne had not been a local defeat. It was the mathematical demonstration that the Reich was fighting against an entire civilization. The next part would reveal this verdict with numbers that, to this day, seem unrealistic. When the war finally ended, and the German generals were led into quiet rooms to give testimony, something curious happened. For the first time in years, there were no maps to defend. There were no orders to justify. There was no propaganda to repeat. There were only facts and defeat. And in front of her, the men who led the offensive in the Ardennes began to speak with an honesty they would never have allowed during the conflict. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, admitted without hesitation that Bastogne was the final revelation of a truth that Germany had been reluctant to see since 1942. The Reich had not lost by tactical inferiority or lack of bravery. He had lost because he fought a modern war with ancient methods. In his testimonies, he describes the sight of the 241 C-47s as the instant when we understood that the enemy possessed resources that surpassed any military calculation. It was not a figure of speech. It was a strategic diagnosis. No land maneuver would make up for the difference between an economy surrounded by blockades and a continental economy running at full load. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, who was directly responsible for the siege of Bastogne, declared that when he saw supplies fall on the besieged city, he realized that he was not facing an airborne division. He was facing an entire nation. His testimony is even harsher. We had the tactics. They had the system. It was the confession that German doctrine, proud of its operational precision, had not been able to keep up with the historical transition that turned logistics into a weapon. Manteuffel reinforced the same idea with an almost painful acknowledgement. When the weather cleared and the sky filled with planes, we knew that any hope had dissolved. Our offensive depended on the fog, theirs production. This phrase, simple and direct, sums up the fundamental contrast of the battle. Germany depended on luck. The United States depended on industry. General Kokott, commander of the 26th Volksgrenadier, one of the units that witnessed the air avalanche up close, offered an even more symbolic view. In a resigned tone, he said that the scene of December 23rd was the most devastating moral blow of the war. We watched supplies descend in thousands of parachutes. We didn't fight soldiers, we fought factories. In his own words, Bastogne had become a mirror in which Germany saw reflected its structural inability to continue the war. His men fought bravely, but marched with patched boots. His tactical units were competent, but they relied on horses to transport ammunition. Their hopes of victory rested on risky offensives, while the adversaries operated with redundant supply networks, capable of regaining a besieged city in a few hours. The most bitter confession came when Kokott compared Bastogne to Stalingrad, but with reversed roles. At Stalingrad, it was the Luftwaffe that promised to supply and failed. In Bastogne, it was the Americans who promised and fulfilled. The phrase he left recorded in the interrogation is lapidary. What we tried to do in Stalingrad, they did in Bastogne, and they made it work. When they analyzed the numbers presented by the Allied interrogators, many German generals were silent. It wasn't a silence of denial, it was recognition. During the Battle of the Bulge, the United States had dropped more than 1,100 tons of supplies on Bastogne alone. Germany, in its entire offensive, had barely been able to supply its own forward units with enough fuel for 3 days of continuous movement. This contrast led a model staff officer to conclude, "We had horses, they had heaven." Bastogne, for these men, was not just a tactical defeat. It was a strategic revelation, the ultimate proof that Germany was fighting against something it could never defeat by force of arms. And yet, there was an even more striking statistic, one that interrogators would point out only at the end, as the final blow to historical analysis, the real ratio of American to German industrial capacity, a proportion that no general could have imagined and that would transform Bastogne into an absolute symbol of the inevitability of defeat. To the men frozen in the trenches around Bastogne, the battle seemed like just another brutal contest for survival. But from afar, from the standpoint of history, that clear morning of December 23rd would reveal something far greater than a broken siege or a salvaged division. It would reveal the exact moment when the war changed its meaning. Until then, Germany believed that victory was synonymous with dominance, fast tanks, coordinated attacks, high morale, tactical discipline. The Wehrmacht fought believing that courage and aggression could make up for any structural deficiency. But Bastogne showed an uncomfortable and profound truth. Modern warfare does not reward only those who advance, it rewards those who sustain it. The strength of the 101st lay not just in the bravery of the men on the front lines, but in the invisible network that fed them. Mechanics overhauling engines in zero cold, female workers sewing parachutes, steel workers shaping airplane parts, farmers sending wheat into compacted feed. Each shot fired at Bastogne was the distant echo of thousands of anonymous hands working non-stop. Germany, observing this silent gear, finally understood what it was up against. They saw the American soldier in the field, but they fought the American worker in the factory. The moral difference was there. It was not just the combat, it was the communion of a society that understood that war is continuity. Bastogne taught that courage without support is only sacrifice, that resistance without rearguard is only a delay of the inevitable, and that no troop, no matter how disciplined, wins when it fights alone. The Germans had confused bravery with self-sufficiency. They believed that determination could replace fuel, that discipline could replace ammunition, that fervor could replace supplies. The war belied them. The true strength of a nation is not measured at the moment of the shot, but in the set of lives and structures that make that shot possible. The 101st Airborne held out not because it was made up of exceptional men, though many were, but because there was an entire nation behind them. A nation that turned clouds into roads, that made the impossible seem routine, that showed the world that support is as vital as courage. The parachutes over Bastogne were not just supplies. They were proof that no one wins alone. And while the German generals digested this bitter revelation, one last statistic, the most devastating of all, was waiting to transform Bastogne from a landmark episode to an undisputed symbol of the end of the Third Reich. When one observes Bastogne from a distance of decades, it is almost impossible not to see in it a mirror of the modern world. The city surrounded, isolated, pressured by cold, hunger and the feeling of abandonment resembles in many ways the emotional state of millions of people today, lives besieged by responsibilities, fatigue, expectations, and invisible silences. Like those men of the 101st Airborne, many continue to fight with limited ammunition, limited energy, scarce time, unstable support. But Bastogne teaches something that transcends military history. No one stands alone. The resupply from the skies was not just a logistical demonstration, it was a gesture of remembrance. It was proof that even isolated, someone still saw them, someone still cared enough to send help in the middle of the storm. In contemporary life, this role is played by ordinary people. The family that offers a word of calm, the friend who sends a message when he realizes that the silence has become too long, the colleague who shares the burden when the day collapses. It's our personal C-47s, the ones that arrive when the weather finally opens up, or when we need it most. And this reflection brings an uncomfortable but necessary question. Who supplies our siege? Because, contrary to what modern logic insists on preaching, absolute independence is not strength. It is fragility masked. Bastogne reveals that the true fortress is built with nets, not walls. In the same way, the second question arises, as essential as the first: who do we supply? Just as the 101st survived because an entire nation decided to prop it up, someone next to us may just be waiting for the gesture that breaks the isolation. The war we define as distant still teaches us about the ties that define the present. And as the viewer reflects on his own encirclement and his own supply routes, one last piece of this story, the most brutal, the most damning, awaits its conclusion. The final statistic that proves, without any room for interpretation, that Bastogne was the day Germany discovered that defeat was written long before the first shot. When one looks at Bastogne from the angle of history, one realizes that the German defeat did not occur when Patton broke the siege, nor when American tanks entered the city exhausted and covered in ice. The collapse happened before, the moment the besiegers raised their binoculars and saw the sky filled with 241 planes that shouldn't have been there. There, at that moment, the fundamental belief of the Reich collapsed. The idea that tactics, discipline and will were enough to win an industrial war. Bastogne relentlessly exposed that Germany was struggling with concepts of the past against a power shaped by the future. The siege did not only break militarily, he broke ideologically. The Blitzkrieg, proud of its speed, has discovered that speed doesn't matter when the enemy can resupply from the air. German maneuverability died under the weight of American logistical reality, and all that came after, the retreats, the confessions, was only the confirmation that modern warfare belongs not to the most daring, but to the most supplied. And this is where Bastogne offers his universal lesson. War is not decided only by courage, strategy, or aggressiveness. War is decided by who can sustain their army the longest, most accurately, on more simultaneous fronts. Logistics do not follow the strategy, it determines the strategy. American abundance was not a luxury, it was a weapon. The German doctrine, built on glimmers of maneuver, was overcome by depots, by factory shifts, by railroad tracks, by workshops that never turned off the lights. The victory at Bastogne was won by those who understood that volume is power, that maintenance is survival, that an army advances only as far as its rear allows. And this understanding was strongly echoed in the final words of one of the German generals themselves, uttered after the surrender. "We were not defeated by soldiers. We were defeated by trucks, by fuel, by planes that kept coming." If you value this detailed analysis and the serious search for historical truth, support the work, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating event of World War II. Comment on which piece of data shocked you the most on this journey: the number of planes, the volume of supplies, or the German recognition that they were fighting an entire civilization. Because Bastogne is not just in the past, it's a reminder. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the channel's next video now, where another incredible and equally relentless story awaits you.